We break down the Dobber Prospects mid-season rankings, including a great discussion on Berkly Catton versus Cayden Lindstrom on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Hadi Kalakesh, joined by Sebastian High, and on today's show, we'll be breaking down the Dobber Prospects mid-season rankings. I'm the Director of North American Scouting for Dobber Prospects. Sebastian is the Head Scout and Director of European Scouting. So we're going to be kind of discussing what we talked about in the rankings and some of the interesting selections that we have in these ranks. So first and foremost, we'll talk about Berkly Catton versus Cayden Lindstrom. It's a hot topic throughout the year, and we had a great discussion on that at our prospects meeting. We'll also discuss some other interesting selections in our rankings, starting with Igor Chernyshov and Nikita Artyumanov in the top 15. In our second segment, we'll talk about Cole Eiserman and Alphonse Frey, Dominic Bedinka, Jesse Pulkkinen. And then in our final segment, we'll talk about John Mustard in the first round and some of the players that weren't in our first round that are in most people's first rounds. But before we get into any of that, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. So I think we can get started here, Sebastian, with this discussion on Berkly Catton versus Cayden Lindstrom. Two very interesting WHL prospects, both producing really, really well for their respective teams. Lindstrom's currently injured and should be coming back soon. But I think the discussion came down to kind of what we prefer and who we give the edge in this conversation. Our WHL scout Luke Sweeney is a big fan of Berkly Catton. You and I are both big fans of both, but we do prefer Cayden Lindstrom. But talk me through how the discussion went and what direction you went at the end of the day.
Yeah, it was a really interesting debate, especially because I think it was one of like the couple like high profile like player debates where the both of us sided on one side and ended up deciding to switch and go with the regional ranking because, as you mentioned, Luke, our WHL scout, is a massive fan of Berkly Catton, and we really respect the input of our regional scouts. And there's so much to love with Catton. This is a player whose level of dynamism is potentially the second best in this draft class, right? Like, he is incredibly dynamic. He's so intelligent, so skilled. He's constantly creating. I think the reason that I myself would still side Lindstrom over Catton, even though it is a pretty tight and pretty debatable, is that he is so projectable. He plays a style right now that I think would be very effective at the NHL level, which cannot be said with Berkly Catton just yet. There's a lot more refining and molding having to be done with Catton's game for him to get to a stage where he can be that impactful against NHL competition. With Cayden Lindstrom, everything would just fall into place very easily. Of course, you have the size, which is the obvious thing, but going beyond that, the way that Lindstrom uses his line mates during rushes, his tendency to go with give and go plays rather than hold on to the puck for too long on his own is something that I personally appreciate a lot. He's a really potent goal scorer and playmaker with really high-end handling ability. I think the defensive upside is also significantly higher with Lindstrom than it is with Catton, and I think all of that kind of combines into making him the safer bet, certainly between these two, and also the one that I think I myself would make. But with Catton, it's all upside, and the reason that we ended up deferring to Luke and putting Berkly Catton at number 3 on our board of Dobber Prospects is because of that sky high upside, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And these are two of the prospects I've scouted the most this year. So I've got a really good sample size on both of them, and both of them have really interesting elements in their games that should translate fairly well. I'm thinking that Catton's work rate and efficacy in forechecks is kind of being undersold. Like, he's a really smart, really efficient kind of player when it comes to approaching players with the right angles, kind of selecting his routes really well, and pressuring players in specific ways that kind of shove them into lanes that are occupied by his teammates. He's constantly he's kind of like a shepherd. He directs players in specific directions off the forecheck, defending the rush. That puts opponents in trouble. Um, but on top of that, I mean, you mentioned the dynamism. It's off the charts. It's ridiculous. Like this player's hands are insane. I really like his in stride shot. He's able to snap his shot in motion really, really well. And on top of that, he's got some of the best playmaking tools in the game. Like his arsenal is I mean, it's so wide. He can pull off any pass he can think of. I'm still looking to see a bit more of that kind of mature give and go kind of play into space, move off the puck type of game from Catton, but most of the time when he pulls off a pass, it's the right pass at the right time. So that's a really interesting part of his game. But for me, Lindstrom is just, I mean, he also has some very particular tools that should translate really well. I mean, his ability to catch pucks in motion is some of the best I've seen in this draft. Like he's constantly able to just, I mean, pucks just stick to his stick. They just, he can take a stretch pass in motion and just, with his back to it, he'll just put his stick out and he'll just land on it. So that gives him a lot of really interesting scenarios and puck touches that other players wouldn't benefit from. On top of that, he's massive, he's strong, he's powerful, he's violent. He's a pest as well. Like between whistles, you'll notice him. He'll make his presence known. But off the ice, talk to anyone who doesn't have to face him, and they love him. Like he's a really good person. So all of that, I think, at the end of the day, Lindstrom's definitely getting picked first between the two. But the argument at the end of the day, and the kind of tiebreaker for me, when it comes to Catton versus Lindstrom, is that Berkly Catton has very little surrounding, whereas Cayden Lindstrom has like some of the best supporting cast in this WHL class, right?
Oh my god, I mean, Gavin McKenna and Andrew Basha doesn't get much better than that, in terms of supporting cast, and Berkly Catton really is on his own there in Spokane, so I fully agree with that. I think that, like, both of us were kind of in the same boat going into our meeting where we were expecting Lindstrom to slot in ahead of Catton, but there being a lot of room for debate within that, just because they are also stylistically two such different players.
Yeah,
It comes down to preference for us mainly, and it's also why the two of us were so happy kind of flip-flopping, and switching Catton on to go over Lindstrom for that reason, because it
yeah,
really is a stylistic preference, and both of these players have significant top line upside at the NHL level, and could be real game breakers against like really good competition. So two very good
for sure.
prospects here.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our next conversation here. Nikita Artemanov and Igor Chernyshov in our top 15, with Artemanov at 14 and Chernyshov at 10, which is significantly higher than I've seen him on most rankings. But you love him. I love him. Talk me through his game.
Igor Chernyshov has the mold of a modern European power forward. He is really, really intense off puck. He's obviously very strong. He's a great skater, real fluid in his motions. I've loved his play both in transition and in the defensive zone, in both the MHL and the KHL. Chernyshov is a player who has been playing some really, really rock solid hockey against some high end competition in the KHL. And while the offensive game has yet to fully pop there, he is one of the better shutdown defensive, like third, fourth liners in the league already. And in transition, he is so composed with the puck on his stick. He makes the right play. He gives a puck to teammates when he's under pressure. He's rarely trying to do too much on his own in transition, especially through the neutral zone. With Chernyshov, a big question mark remains the playmaking game in the offensive zone. He's quite predictable as being a goal scorer in the
Yeah.
offensive zone, and when he does try to make a pass, he really telegraphs it. And like on 2-on-1 specifically, I've seen him telegraph a pass like about 3 or 4 times, and every single time the pass just gets easily picked off by the one defender. Where
Yeah.
using his body to drive the middle lane would be a far more effective use of his toolkit and his strengths. But instead, he can take a bit too much of a passive approach in those situations. But that being said, he has the toolkit to be a really high-end top six winger in the NHL with upside in all three zones. And the shot is awesome too. But
Yeah.
Nikita Artemanov is perhaps a bit less toolsy in the raw sense, like Chernyshov is, but he's been playing significantly more minutes in the KHL and has been doing a lot with them, right? Like, what have you liked so much about Artemanov with Torpedo so far this year?
Yeah, real quick. I mean, this is a player who forechecks really interestingly. I think that his ability to just pressure opponents constantly is really, really good. I've liked the playmaking game as well. I think the defensive side of the game still needs some work, but he's one of the best transition supporters I've seen this year. Like he's constantly doing something in transition that helps a teammate. He plays off the puck really well, creates off puck assists, drive the net, and is really good at making plays inside of contact and playing towards the middle, which like that skill set for an average sized player in Artemanov, I think he's like 6 foot 180, something like that. Like that's really interesting. But what really makes Chernyshov stand out is a combination of size at like 6'2", 195, and the defensive game and the intelligence and the awareness. Um, that combination is pretty rare, and I think teams are going to love that from Chernyshov. But that wraps things up for our first segment. We'll talk about some more prospects in our second. We'll talk about Cole Eiserman, who, spoiler, is at 16th in our rankings, and there's a reason for that. We'll get into that and a lot more in this next segment after these messages from our sponsors at Game Time and FanDuel. If you're looking to buy cheap tickets last minute for any event, Game Time is the best place to get that done. Game Time is a personal favorite of mine because my schedule changes around a lot. I can find myself with an afternoon free out of nowhere, and Game Time is really reliable when it comes to getting you those last minute tickets. You can get them up to the last minute before the game, and sometimes an hour after they start. And it's not just for games; it's for anything from theater to comedy to any sports event. Really, anything that needs tickets, Game Time has you covered. They got a bunch of deals to save you money. My favorite is zone deals. You pick the section, and Game Time picks a seat, and that gives you an average of about 18% of savings. And the Game Time guarantee makes sure that you always get the best price. So if you find a ticket in the same section and same row for less than what Game Time has to offer, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. To take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed.
Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same game parlays, exclusive props, and far more. I know I personally am always a really big fan of same game parlays, especially when I'm going to attend a game live. It just makes the action all the more exciting, being able to kind of curate some guesses of what's going to happen in the game and see if it ends up happening. It really, really does add to the action. Just visit fanduel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA.
Alrighty, so moving on to our next segment, we'll be talking about some of the prospects we have in the kind of 15 to 25 range. I think we can start off with Cole Eiserman, which at 16th overall is the lowest he is on any rankings. Um, Myself, you, and our USA scout David Sod have our thoughts about him. I thought he could have been a bit higher. Even though I'm not a big fan, I still think that 16 is a bit low. But David was really insistent that there were a decent amount of guys that were better than Cole Eiserman in this USA class. So I think we can start things off with the playstyle. Eiserman is easily the best goal scorer in this draft. Like his shot is ridiculous. His motion in the offensive zone to get it open, amazing as well. Everything else is a big question mark in at best and abysmal at worst. Not a defensively engaged player, not the fastest skater, not the most projectable skater either. His defensive zone positioning, his transition game, his physical game, even like, and especially I think his playmaking. I mean, all those areas are either big question marks or straight up just bad. So that kept him out of our top 15. But like I said, I think he could. I have him personally like between 11, like 10 and 12 in my rankings. Do you think we could have placed him a bit higher? Or are you satisfied with the spot in the rankings?
I think I myself am satisfied. I fully agree that this is the low like edge of his range. I think
Mhm.
that there were definitely arguments to be made for him as high as probably like 13 or 14 on our board. Like I think like Liam Greentree had a lot of popular support. It would have been difficult for us to slot him behind Cole Eiserman.
Yeah,
But after that, when we got into like Nikita Artemanov, Trevor Connolly territory, I think those are probably the two players that were kind of hot takes to put over Eiserman,
yeah.
at least internally for us at Dobber. But I think like with Eiserman, it is so dichotomized in his game. There are certain things that are just so intriguing. The shot, the off puck movement, as you mentioned, are elite. They're excellent. He's
Mhm.
really young for the draft class as well, and that is a combination that scares me in ranking
Yeah.
him low. And I think both of us were kind of like sweating a little bit about having him this low on our board, but
Yeah.
it is a statement, and it's the only statement that I think that we could have made that correlates to our popular opinion from our viewings. Like, how many good viewings have we caught of Eisman this year where he's genuinely making a consistent impact and tilting the ice in his team's favor? It's been rough this season. There's a bit
Yeah.
more to like there in his D-1 when he was in less of like a prominent role, or where the expectations weren't as high. But he the decision making, the mental pace, the problem solving at high speeds, obviously the
It's bad.
defensive engagement are all significantly below average, to the point where the question with Eiserman isn't can he score goals in the NHL. He has some tools that should make that very, very possible. The question is, can he round it out for that to be a consistent and reliable threat? And if it's not, then you're looking at like a third line streaky goal scorer who might pot you 20 to 25 a year, but gives you nothing else.
Yeah.
Like, think about like 2-3 years ago, Mike Hoffman type of player comp.
Yeah.
But if he's able to really, really, he doesn't have to be a diverse and versatile player for him to round out his game. It's more about not being a liability when he's not playing within his strengths. If that is able to happen, then I think we see significant top six upside. I just haven't seen personally from my viewings all that much to get me excited for that progression. But the youth and the high end like flashes that we have certainly seen make it really, really difficult for us to rank Eiserman. Like, he was
Yeah.
definitely the player that I think the room was most anxious about in terms of
Mhm.
ranking for those reasons.
Yeah.
But fascinating prospect, and there's certainly a non-negligible chance that he ends up within our like top 8 at the end of the season if he's able to quell some of our doubts.
Yeah, for sure. It's so weird because a player who's currently scoring a goal a game has given me maybe two or three performances where I'm like, oh, maybe there's something there. But moving on to a player you like very much in Alphonse Frey. He shows up at 18 on our board, which is among the highest, if not the highest, among all the public scouting boards. But yeah, I mean, we've talked about him at length. I think he's a really interesting player. The combination of offensive skill, transition ability, the defensive game as well for a player of this kind of profile is really interesting. And I definitely agree that he should be in our top 20. So I'm glad we got him in there. But closing things off here with Dominic Badinka and Jesse Pulkkinen in our first round, this isn't something you see everywhere. Um, We've covered Jesse Pulkkinen fairly well on this on this board, but on this podcast rather. But talk me through Dominic Badinka's game and what makes him a bona fide first rounder for you.
Yeah, so for me, Dominic Badinka is a really, really straightforward NHL projection for the most part. He is a great skater. He is really intelligent defensively, positionally, both in the way that he defends the rush and also the cycle. He is consistently scanning and readjusting his position. He keeps a pretty tight gap. He uses his skating to really apply pressure. He's very big, very strong. He's 6'3", and he uses that to out leverage opponents. He's playing like second pairing SHL minutes, and he's looking like a 24-year-old out on the ice on a decent number of nights. There's certainly some games in there that have been a lot more neurotic, where it's quite clear that he's a teenager among men. And I think that neuroticism is one question mark that we definitely still have as a group with Badinka. But the foundation of defensive solidity and the breakout game, which is really quite key to his projection. He's a really solid passer, consistently has an outlet in his back pocket when he's pressured that he can use, but is
Yeah,
always looking to make a pass to really like progress play quickly and to counterattack. And he's a bit of a fulcrum in that breakout of trying to relaunch an attack, and he's very skilled at that already. In the offensive zone, he's a lot more limited, a lot more passive, but you're seeing some positional fluidity there where he's really moving around on the top of the umbrella during the cycle, and trying to kind of change angles and try to shift defensive structures. But The upside with him is certainly on the defensive side of things and in the breakout, which is also a profile that NHL teams always adore and invest in and continuously support in terms of the development. And I think that Badinka is a player that is going to very likely receive very consistent and very thorough development advice from whichever team ends up drafting him.
For sure. But that wraps things up for our second segment. Now we'll get into our third, where we talk about some prospects that, that kind of round out this group. And prospects of pretty similar profiles, which we'll kind of break down. We'll talk about John Mustard, who we have in our first round, and then 4 players we have outside of our first round on this. After these messages from our sponsors here at eBay Motors.
Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers to roof racks to LED headlights and far more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has everything you need to keep your vehicle covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what it is that you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, which is available to US customers only, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
Alrighty, so let's close things off here with a discussion on a couple of I think we can call them power forwards. They're pretty similar in their kind of build here,
Yeah.
but I think we can start off with the one we have highest of the 5 we're going to discuss in this segment, and John Mustard. Mustard's a player I've watched a very decent amount of this year, and every time he kind of gives me a different element of his game, and I'm banking on most of it kind of coming together. I think the defensive game is above average for sure, but not by a large amount. What I really like with Mustard though is how dynamic he is at times with the puck. It's in flashes and it's not all the time, but there are some sequences where you see him just blast through the neutral zone with speed and crossovers and lateral mobility and agility, and you just kind of wonder at a player this size with this kind of skill set being able to kind of replicate that at the NHL level. The goal scoring ability is a big plus. I think his in stride curl and drag shot is among the best in this class. Um, on top of that, he's a really decent playmaker with great hands. And yeah, he's got enough elements in his game, but they're all in flashes. And the bet with Mustard is that all of that comes together in a cohesive package. And that's what makes him so interesting for me. And that's why we have him at 31st overall, because our USA scout, David, is also a big fan of his and pushed for him hard in the first round there. But moving on to the players that we have outside of the first round. And I think we can start with the highest one of the bunch, and Emil Hemming. Talk me through what left him out of this first round, and overall what you think might make us kind of bite our tongue on that later on.
Yeah, like with Emil Hemming, the upside is completely congregated in the goal scoring aspect of the game. He has a
Yep.
really good shot that he likes to use all the time, and that's true against junior competition just as it is against professional competition. Like he's been splitting this season between U20 hockey in Finland and Liga with TPS. And his
Yeah.
role has certainly been very different in those two contexts, but it's been very steady. Like he loves to shoot the puck. How he uses that and leverages that has been a lot more inconsistent this season, and I think we've had a lot more questions around that. The playmaking game is relatively non-existent against professional competition specifically. In Liga, he's been primarily a defensive forward and been playing a shutdown defensive role pretty well. On top of just shooting every single time he has the puck in the offensive zone. That's been his style
Yeah.
of play in Liga so far this season, which is a little bit limited for me. There are some limitations around creativity and dare in terms of trying things and escaping his comfort zone. He kind of settles in within his comfort zone, which is one thing that I have noticed that makes me a little bit more skeptical of his chances of hitting his high end upside, which is probably around a second line scorer with significant upside as a defensive contributor, a shooter in the offensive zone, and a physical presence. I think that the physical side of his game, especially on puck, could still be developed a lot. But the tools are there. He's very big and he's very strong. How he uses that is still a bigger question mark. But with him, there's a lot of things that still need to get put together. But if it all does come together, then I completely see the argument behind having having him in like that 20 to 25 range. Though I have
Yeah,
seen him inside a couple top 20 rankings, which I just have not quite understood from my personal viewings. But he's a
yeah.
really interesting player who reminds me a little bit of Casper Haltonen from last year.
For sure. Yeah, I definitely agree. He's kind of got some of those elements with him. But moving on, we've got Ryder Ritchie at 36, and there's a reason he slipped so much between the first and the our first rankings and the second ones. For me, the main issue with Ritchie is, his hands are great when he's stick handling up the ice in possession. When it comes to getting possession, when it comes to receiving a pass or catching a dump in off the rim, or retrieving a puck on the forecheck, it's not good, and he's not getting as many puck touches as other players because of that. There's also been a significant dip in his ability to use his creativity, to use his intelligence to create offense, and especially create advantages, in the offensive zone. So that's been a big drop off. And overall, I saw a lot more of him in the first kind of month of the year than I did now, and usually it's the opposite with prospects, which doesn't really bode well for his immediate future. But closing things off with two players that we have outside of the top 50, who are pretty much staples of a lot of first rounds. Um, I think we can start with Adam Yeko because I feel like we've both watched a decent amount of his, right? So,
Yeah.
um, what's your thoughts on Yeko overall, and why does he show up at 54th in our rankings?
I think that there was a bit of a surge in his rankings in the fall, specifically when he was playing most of his minutes down the middle with the Edmonton Oil Kings and had a couple games where he was flashing. Like he was embodying like that 6'5" big center hulking physical presence type of role, which is obviously always quite popular among NHL teams, and we're seeing a similar type of rise with a player like Dean Letourneau. But as soon
Mhm.
as Yeko moved to the wing and was very much slotted into a complementary winger role with Edmonton, which is completely within Yeko's comfort zone, is where he's been playing his best hockey in my viewings. It's a lot
Yeah.
more limited of a capacity, and I think that's one of the reasons that we're going to see Yeko slip maybe a little bit in draft boards, maybe not be as big of a consensus first rounder as he was a couple months ago. But for
Mhm.
us, we've always seen that complementary toolkit and liked it, but there's been very little that has gotten us enthusiastic enough to even enter like first round debate, let alone like actually being slotted anywhere near our like top 32 or top 40, because
Yeah.
he's good at what he does, but he's very linear. He doesn't add all that much dynamism to the game. His defensive game is fine, but not a standout. In transition,
Mhm.
he often takes a back seat and just waits for his line mates to get the puck into the offensive zone. I think there are some limitations there in all three zones,
Yeah.
but he's a decent complementary player that I think should get picked in like rounds 2 or 3 come draft day. But the first round hype was perhaps a little bit too early.
Yeah, and speaking of which, that brings me to Maxim Massé, who's one of the players I've scouted the most this year. I've been following the QMJHL pretty closely, and Massé is really interesting because he's a player that almost never scans, but he doesn't really need to scan in order to connect with teammates. He's got this kind of sixth sense that's really interesting playmaking wise. I just haven't seen much. Well, I haven't seen enough defensively. I don't necessarily rate his goal scoring ability, his shot in isolation as kind of a plus tool. Um, and he lacks kind of that pop, that at least average kind of level speed in order to be able to keep up with plays offensively. So there's big question marks I think with Moss's production, but with Moss's projection rather, that keeps him outside of this conversation for me. And in the QMJHL, I've been a much bigger fan of Raoul Bollard, who's 37th in our rankings and the first QMJHLer off the board. Whereas with Massé, it's like there's a lot of questions and a lot of habits that need to go to get up to par along with the tools, which isn't ideal. Um, but that wraps things up for today's show. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you wanted to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They got all your news and updates about what's going on around sports. And make sure to tune in for our next shows as we start our prospects coverage for the month of March. This has been Hattie Kalakash with Sebastian High, and we hope you tune in next time.